Mark Dreyfus, the Attorney General, has showed us what we already knew. He's thin-skinned and not terribly competent. He lost it at a reporter who had the temerity to ask him about his own policy area and about a failing within his own policy area.
Do you owe an apology to those in the community that have been subjected to misdeeds by some of these individuals?
Olivia, the reason that these people have been released from immigration detention is because the High Court has made a decision that means it is illegal for us to continue to detain them.
I want to suggest to you that that question is an absurd question. You are asking a Cabinet Minister, 3 ministers of the Crown, to apologise for upholding the law of Australia, for acting in accordance with the law of Australia, for following the instructions of the High Court of Australia. I will not be apologising for upholding the law. I will not be apologising for pursuing the rule of law, and I will not be apologising for acting. Do not interrupt. I will not be apologising for acting. I will not be apologising for acting in accordance with a High Court decision. Your question is an absurd one.
The reporter asked a fair but probing question of genuine public concern. Convicted criminals are being released into the community, and the government failed to foresee this might be a problem. But instead of giving reasonable answers, Mark Dreyfus lost it and he obfuscated. He castigated the reporter for supposedly interrupting him, and labelled the reporter's question to be absurd. Now imagine what would happen if a Conservative did this. There would be outcry. The papers would write the Conservative were disqualified, that the behaviour was not becoming of the office, that they perhaps didn't have the temperament becoming of the office they purported to hold. Indeed, we don't actually need to imagine. We simply need to look at how the media covered Donald Trump. It appears there is rather a double standard. When Mark Dreyfus attacks a reporter, it's okay, but when other Conservatives attack a reporter, it isn't. It's a little bit odd, but we all know how the reporting often goes. One might argue that Mark Dreyfus has shown himself to be unfit for the office of Attorney General, and lacking the temperament demanded of an Attorney General, but we're just speculating here. I'll leave it to you to decide what you think. Now, the background to this whole debacle makes it even worse. It involves a High Court decision that overturned the role of indefinite detention for asylum seekers who could neither clear security checks but could not be returned to their home country. The government notably knew this High Court decision was going to be coming. They didn't necessarily know how it was going to fall, but they knew the High Court was going to make a decision. Now, the people released into the community were convicted of serious offences such as murder, amongst other things. There were clearly people who would not pass security checks to be released into the community, hence why they were held in detention. But because they'd been politically active or for other reasons, it was not safe to return them home, hence why they ended up in indefinite detention. They were stuck in limbo. Now, being in limbo is obviously not ideal, but nor is it ideal releasing a murderer into the community. Now, the High Court found that the relevant legislation giving rise to indefinite detention was unconstitutional. This turned on how the law was phrased, and in particular the separation of powers. It's the type of thing that could be fixed up if you amended the law, but the law as written was going to be unconstitutional. Now, the specifics behind this are a little bit tangential, but the very important thing is the government knew that the High Court was going to make a decision. The government knew it could have amended the law in advance to mitigate the High Court decision, and the government failed to do so or make any precautionary plans. This led to a mad rush to patch things up after the High Court decision ultimately came into being. Now, the government has no control over the High Court. The High Court's decision is what the High Court's decision is. One might argue the High Court has become a little bit more activist over time, but that's a separate question. The government can't control the decision. What the government can control is how it proactively considers that decision. The government can decide that maybe the High Court might decide in a particular way, and maybe the government needs to take precautions. The government should have thought about what happens if the law is rendered unconstitutional. And if there's advice that was a live possibility, they maybe should have actually done something rather than leaving it until the last minute. The government has rightly been called out on this. The government has been held up for failing to do its job and foresee what could have gone wrong, for failing to amend the law as necessary, for failing to take precautions to ensure that criminals weren't released into the community and could then go and do potentially criminal things after they were released. The government simply failed to take precautions. The concern is that the government failed to preemptively consider what the High Court might decide and take actions in advance, or at least prepare for how the court might rule. The government was simply asleep at the wheel. That's why people are concerned. But instead of answering straight questions about this and giving a straight answer, Mark Dreyfus has obfuscated. He claimed that by releasing the detainees, they were merely following the law, and this is what should have been done. Now, certainly he is correct that the government needs to follow the law. If the High Court says you need to release this person, then the government needs to release that person. But that's not really the point. The point is that the government should have amended the law to prevent this outcome. People aren't concerned the government was following the law. People were concerned the government failed to proactively think about what the law meant and what would happen if the High Court made this decision. The issue is about the government's failure to act. The issue is not about the government following the High Court's decision. The issue is about their incompetence in relation to that specific law and failing to take actions. Mark Dreyfus, however, has sidestepped this whole issue. The doublespeak, the obfuscation, the sidestepping, and the gaslighting are clearly insane at this point. There's gaslighting going on by simply sidestepping the question. He's trying to paint this and redirect it as being about simply following the High Court's decision, trying to claim the government was not doing anything wrong. But like I've indicated, that was never the concern. The concern was that the government failed to amend the law so that this outcome would be prevented. By reframing the question, Mark Dreyfus is simply failing to answer the question and failing to address people's concerns. And this ultimately backfires, because people know when they're being gaslit. However, it is unfortunately on form for the Albanese government, which seems to have fallen into a rather disingenuous trap. It also appears to be slightly on form for Mark Dreyfus, because if you remember back to the voice referendum, as I've talked about before, Mark Dreyfus wrongly claimed that the Indigenous voice, if it were to come into being, would only speak to things that differently or differentially affect Indigenous Australians. However, he was simply wrong. Whether he was intentionally wrong, whether he was simply mistaken, that's a little bit neither here nor there. But in his second reading speech, he was wrong, because the Indigenous voice could have spoken to anything it wanted, not just things that specifically affected Indigenous Australians. So clearly they are on form about potentially sidestepping the whole issue and failing to answer questions and address concerns that voters ultimately have. The fact that they haven't given a straight answer or taken responsibility for this whole debacle is probably even more insulting than telling the reporter that the question is absurd or they shouldn't interrupt when it was simply disgorging irrelevant tangential information. The reporter interrupted because Mark Dreyfus wasn't properly answering the question, and the failure and the lack of desire to answer that question was obviously frustrating, not just to the journalists, but to the general public. Now, it's very clear at this point that Mark Dreyfus is a bad Attorney General, the Albanese government is a bad government, they're lurching from debacle to debacle, and seemingly have no clue. Seemingly have no clue about the detainee issue, but also no clue about myriad other things, such as the cost of living crisis that is ongoing at the moment. The government appears to have become a rather large failure. But do let me know your thoughts about this whole situation in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think.